The headline tore across television screens and phone notifications with the speed of lightning. Kim Jong-un threatens Israel if Greta Thunberg is not released. For a world already drowning in crises, the words felt unreal, like a fever dream stitched together from incompatible realities. Here was the secretive strongman of North Korea, a figure defined by nuclear tests and military parades, suddenly invoking the name of a teenage climate activist arrested thousands of miles away. The absurdity struck like a thunderclap. Commentators froze mid-broadcast. Social media feeds convulsed with disbelief. How could these three names, Greta, Kim, Israel, share a headline, let alone a stage in history? It was as if a scriptwriter had spliced genres, the stern thriller of geopolitics colliding with the tender drama of youth rebellion. And yet it was real. The camera of imagination pans across the globe. In Seoul, analysts scramble to parse what this means for fragile security. In Tel Aviv, officials wrestle with the humiliation of being threatened by a regime often dismissed as an outlier. In Stockholm, Greta's parents sit stunned, their daughter's quiet defiance now thrust into an international hostage drama. Everywhere, whispers of disbelief echo the same refrain. How did the fight for climate justice become entangled with nuclear brinkmanship? For progressives watching, the irony cut deep. Here was a dictator whose own people knew the suffocating silence of repression, suddenly claiming to champion the freedom of a young woman who symbolized resistance. But beneath the irony, something more dangerous simmered. Kim was inserting himself into the heart of a Middle Eastern conflict, wielding Greta's name as a weapon in his eternal quest for attention and leverage. This wasn't just politics. It was theater of the absurd, a high-wire act where every move carried risk. The world wasn't merely watching. It was holding its breath, unsure whether to laugh at the surrealism or fear the consequences. Because behind the spectacle lurked a darker truth. Dictators thrive on chaos, and chaos had just found a new heroine, whether she wanted the role or not. But how did Greta Thunberg end up in the middle of this storm? And why was Kim Jong-un suddenly her self-declared protector? Greta Thunberg had not entered Israel as a celebrity seeking headlines. She came, as she always did, with the posture of a protester, a young woman willing to put her body on the line for the causes she believed in. The march that day was chaotic, a swirl of placards demanding climate justice and banners calling for Palestinian rights. In Greta's eyes, the struggles were intertwined: environmental collapse, displacement, occupation, all connected by the same logic of power crushing the vulnerable. When police moved in, the cameras caught it instantly. Greta, slight and composed, was lifted off her feet and dragged away. The image of her, hands restrained, eyes steady, spread in seconds. For her supporters, it was proof that even in the face of brute force, Greta refused to bend. For critics, it was evidence of reckless provocation, a teenager meddling in conflicts she could never fully understand. The reactions split the world in two. Progressive circles erupted with outrage, calling her detention a shameful act against free expression. Climate activists in London unfurled massive banners reading "Free Greta Now." Students in New York staged vigils. On TikTok, clips of her arrest looped under soundtracks of protest anthems. But in other corners, her arrest was framed as the inevitable consequence of a polarizing figure pushing too far. Commentators in Israel accused her of hiding political firebombs beneath the language of climate justice. Conservative voices online called her nothing more than a performance artist who finally crossed a line. And then, into this storm of debate, came the thunder of Kim Jong-un. His regime released a statement. If Greta was not freed, Israel would face consequences. The words were cryptic but chilling, draped in the shadow of missiles and artillery that had long defined North Korea's diplomacy. The global reaction was instant disbelief. A dictator who silences students in his own country was now demanding freedom for one abroad? But for Kim, Greta was not the point. She was a tool. By positioning himself as her unlikely protector, he thrust North Korea into a Middle Eastern conflict where it had no natural place. He hijacked the spotlight, transforming a teenage activist into a geopolitical pawn on his chessboard. His warning was less about Greta's chains and more about his own hunger to be seen, feared, and considered relevant. The stakes now soared beyond the plight of a single activist. Israel, already entangled in conflicts both internal and external, now faced the bizarre prospect of being challenged by a nuclear-armed dictator halfway across the world. The United Nations scrambled to interpret the meaning. World leaders hesitated, unsure whether to mock the absurdity or confront the danger. Commentators began to ask the question no one wanted to answer. What happens when a regime defined by its volatility inserts itself into a crisis where emotions already burn white-hot? Because here was the paradox. A dictator known for missiles now claimed moral guardianship over a teenager. And in that paradox lay the seeds of both comedy and catastrophe. What could possibly go wrong? To understand the madness, we need to look at the villains in this story and the heroes. To understand the sheer absurdity of Kim Jong-un positioning himself as Greta Thunberg's defender, we must first step inside his playbook, a script he has been rehearsing his entire life. It is a manual not of diplomacy, but of manipulation. Every move Kim makes on the global stage is designed to keep the world's gaze fixed on him, no matter the cost. He does not seek consensus, nor does he care for moral standing. His currency is fear. His theater is spectacle. His weapon is unpredictability. Kim's regime has long used hostages and detainees as bargaining chips. From the tragic case of Otto Warmbier, the American student who returned from North Korean captivity in a coma, to the countless South Korean fishermen and Japanese citizens abducted over decades, the tactic has been the same. Human lives transformed into leverage. By holding them, by parading them, by releasing them only under conditions that magnify his own power, Kim ensures his grip on relevance. Each prisoner becomes a stage prop in the drama of dictatorship. And then there is propaganda, the oxygen that sustains his rule. In Pyongyang, television screens beam carefully orchestrated images of Kim as a godlike figure. Smiling children presenting him flowers. Generals trembling with devotion, citizens applauding until their hands ache. Reality is not permitted to exist unfiltered. To question the performance is to risk your life. Inside his borders, he is the hero of every story. Outside, he revels in being the villain, because even villainy guarantees attention. This is why Greta's arrest was irresistible to him. Not because he believed in her cause, not because he respected her courage, but because her name was currency. She was the world's most recognizable young activist, and her detention was already sparking outrage. By attaching himself to her story, Kim could launder his own brutality under the guise of moral outrage. It was theater at its most cynical. A dictator who silences his own students, now demanding freedom for someone else's. The hypocrisy could not be starker. In North Korea, children are taught to revere him from the moment they can walk. Dissent is unthinkable. Entire families vanish into prison camps if even one member questions the regime. Public executions are staged not only to punish, but to terrify. Universities are indoctrination centers, not arenas of debate. For Kim to suddenly pose as the champion of Greta Thunberg, a girl whose power lies in questioning authority, was like a wolf draping itself in a shepherd's cloak. But Kim knew what he was doing. The global media, addicted to spectacle, would not be able to resist the storyline. Greta and Kim, two names never meant to appear in the same sentence, now entwined. North Korean state television wasted no time. Within hours of his warning to Israel, broadcasters were flashing Greta's photo alongside images of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Her youthful face became another prop, another tool of manipulation, beamed into living rooms across Pyongyang as proof of Kim's supposed moral authority. The image was grotesque. Innocence hijacked by authoritarianism, dignity hijacked by fear. And yet, for all the theater, the danger was real. Kim thrives on pushing boundaries precisely because no one knows how far he is willing to go. His threats are never just words. Each statement carries the shadow of the nuclear arsenal that underpins his regime's survival. By tying Greta's fate to his rhetoric, he was not only mocking international norms, he was raising the stakes of her detention to a global crisis. This was the villain's brilliance, to twist the truth so thoroughly that the world hesitates, caught between laughter at the absurdity and terror at the potential consequences. He did not need to believe in Greta's cause. He only needed to convince others that he held a piece of it hostage. But every villain, no matter how powerful, is defined by his opposite. For all his bluster and control, Kim's stagecraft was about to be disrupted by a figure he could neither intimidate nor co-opt. Because if this was Kim's theater, who was the unlikely hero standing at its center? Before her name became shorthand for defiance, before presidents and prime ministers hurled insults at her on social media, Greta Thunberg was simply a quiet Swedish teenager who refused to go to school one morning. It was an ordinary day turned extraordinary. Armed with nothing more than a handmade sign and a conviction that the adults of the world were failing their children, she sat down outside the Swedish parliament and waited. The air was cool, the sky gray, and yet what began as silence in Stockholm soon became a thunder heard around the world. At first, she was dismissed. Just one girl on a sidewalk. Politicians walked past without so much as a glance. Journalists barely noticed. But Greta had something few others possessed, an unyielding consistency. She returned the next day and the day after until people began to take notice. Other students joined her. Strangers stopped to talk. And soon her solitary act of refusal swelled into a movement. Fridays for Future was born not from institutions or think tanks, but from the stubbornness of a single teenager who refused to move. Her rise was not glamorous. Greta was awkward, blunt, often uncomfortable in the limelight. But that awkwardness was precisely her weapon. Where polished politicians relied on spin and charm, Greta wielded truth with disarming simplicity. She did not smile when it was expected. She did not flatter leaders or stroke their egos. She stared them down. In 2019, she stood before the United Nations and delivered the words that seared into history. "How dare you?" It was not just a speech, it was an indictment. Her voice quivered with anger, her eyes blazed with grief, and in that moment, millions saw what courage looked like when stripped of compromise. Of course, courage came with consequences. Greta was arrested in Germany for blocking coal mines, detained in Norway during protests, pulled away by police in London. Each time, the images repeated the same story. A young woman in handcuffs, small against the backdrop of armored officers, but radiating a calm that made the spectacle look ridiculous. The irony was unavoidable. Nations that tolerated corruption and inaction could not tolerate a teenager holding a cardboard sign. And each arrest only amplified her message. What set Greta apart was that she was never just talking about climate anymore. Yes, the planet was her cause, but the principle was deeper. She stood for the right to speak truth against power. She embodied the idea that conscience could not be silenced by force. Immigrant families saw in her the reflection of their own children told to stay quiet. Marginalized groups saw in her the proof that even one voice, dismissed and mocked, could rattle the highest halls of authority. Her face became a canvas onto which entire communities projected their longing for dignity, for representation, for defiance. And this was precisely why Greta terrified her opponents. Leaders who thrived on control were disarmed by her refusal to play their game. When Donald Trump sneered at her online, Greta simply turned his words back at him with quiet mockery. When oil executives rolled their eyes, she refused to leave the room. Her power was not in dominance, but in stillness. She never shouted louder than her critics. She let their rage echo against the wall of her composure until it collapsed on itself. That is what made the image of her arrest in Israel so powerful. Surrounded by police, wrists restrained, Greta's expression was almost serene. Not defiant in anger, not broken in fear, just steady as if to say, "You can restrain my body, but you cannot restrain my truth." The photo ricocheted around the globe, stirring both fury and inspiration. For supporters, it was proof that she lived the very values she preached: courage, persistence, dignity. For detractors, it was yet another provocation, a young woman daring to step into conflicts she had no business entering. But whether loved or loathed, Greta could not be ignored. In that moment, she was no longer just the climate activist from Sweden. She was a universal symbol of resistance. Her cause transcended borders, issues, and even ideology. She had become a stand-in for every silenced voice, every punished dissenter, every conscience squeezed under the weight of power. Greta's presence in handcuffs spoke more loudly than any dictator's speech, because her calm shattered the illusion that force equals strength. It was this moral clarity, this unshakable dignity that made Kim Jong-un's intervention so jarring. The world knew Greta had always been a thorn in the side of the powerful, but for one of the most repressive leaders alive to suddenly brand himself her protector, it was a collision of narratives that felt almost impossible. And yet, it was real. Her calm resistance set the stage for one of the strangest geopolitical showdowns in modern history. The images of Greta Thunberg's arrest had already sparked outrage, but the aftermath transformed her detention into a global firestorm. Israel wasted no time shaping its narrative. Officials portrayed her not as an innocent activist, but as a provocateur, someone who had crossed the line from climate advocacy into political agitation. They pointed to her chants, her alignment with Palestinian protesters, her willingness to blend environmental concerns with questions of occupation. In their telling, Greta wasn't a victim. She was a disruptor, a teenager who had chosen to wade into one of the most volatile conflicts in the world. Yet beyond Israel's borders, the story resonated differently. In Brussels, members of the European Parliament demanded her release, warning that Israel had made a mistake that could alienate young generations across the continent. In New York, climate groups staged impromptu marches outside consulates, their banners calling Greta a prisoner of conscience. The United Nations, caught between delicate alliances, issued a carefully worded statement emphasizing the right to peaceful protest, which only fueled speculation that behind the scenes, diplomats were working frantically to resolve the crisis. The divide was sharp. To her critics, Greta had been reckless. To her supporters, she was now a martyr for justice. And into that fracture, Kim Jong-un hurled his threat like a torch into dry grass. His warning, vague but menacing, threw gasoline on the fire. Suddenly, the detention of a Swedish teenager was no longer a local incident. It was a potential flashpoint in global security. Analysts debated on live television whether Kim was bluffing, but no one dared dismiss him entirely. In foreign ministries across the world, the scene bordered on cinematic. Diplomats huddled in tense conversations, whispering in hallways about possible outcomes. Was this the moment Israel would have to concede to global outrage? Or would it harden its stance, unwilling to bow to pressure from a dictator known for empty threats? Behind closed doors, ambassadors phoned one another in urgency, voices hushed but urgent. What happens if Israel ignores him? What happens if it doesn't? Meanwhile, social media became its own battlefield. Hashtags surged, like Free Greta, Stand With Greta, Dictators for Greta. Memes mocked the bizarre alignment of a teenage climate activist and a nuclear-armed dictator, while others celebrated Greta as a figure so powerful that even Kim Jong-un felt compelled to invoke her name. The noise online amplified the stakes offline, pushing governments to act faster, harder, louder. The world was not only watching, it was participating. Ordinary people felt invested in the drama unfolding on the world stage. Greta's plight was no longer just about her arrest. It was about identity, freedom, conscience, and the meaning of protest in an age of surveillance and suppression. Each new statement, each new headline, carried the weight of a chess move in a match that felt like it could spiral out of control. And so the tension built, minute by minute, hour by hour. Would Israel bow to global pressure, recognizing that the optics of detaining Greta outweighed any benefit? Or would it double down, determined to prove that no activist, no matter how famous, could challenge its authority? Each possibility seemed fraught with consequences, each path leading toward confrontation. The stage was set, the actors in place, the spotlight blinding. And then came the mic drop moment. For days, the world had been gripped by the noise. Israel's stern press briefings, Kim Jong-un's bellicose threats, commentators shouting over each other on split-screen broadcasts. The tension rose like static in the air, every headline crackling with speculation. But amid all that thunder, A quiet voice prepared to break through. It came not as a fiery speech shouted from a stage, but as a carefully released statement smuggled from detention and shared with the press. The setting was almost mundane. A gray courthouse corridor, the buzz of security radios, journalists pressed shoulder to shoulder with notepads and cameras ready. Then, like a sudden stillness before a storm, the atmosphere shifted. Reporters looked down at the sheet of paper handed to them, Greta Thunberg's words. The first lines were simple. No accusations, no bitterness. Just clarity. She wrote of the cause that had brought her to Israel, of the march she had joined, of the belief that climate justice and human justice could not be separated. Her handwriting was steady, her phrasing deliberate. There was no trace of fear. Instead, there was resolve, the kind that disarms rather than provokes. Journalists began reading aloud, their voices hushed but firm. The courthouse, filled with the usual noise of footsteps and chatter, fell silent. Each sentence carried weight, punctuated by pauses that felt heavier than shouts. "This is not about me," she declared in one of the statement's most searing lines. "This is about justice. Justice for people who are silenced. Justice for lands that are stolen. Justice for a planet that is burning." The room seemed to hold its breath. Pens scratched furiously as correspondents tried to keep pace, while others fumbled to record every word. Cameras zoomed in on the paper itself, Greta's signature scrawled at the bottom. For a moment, the world stopped spinning on the axis of threats and counter-threats. The contrast could not have been sharper. While Kim Jong thundered from across the globe, brandishing missiles and menace, Greta whispered truth with words alone. One voice sought fear, the other embodied dignity, and the contrast was devastating. Even her critics, those who had branded her reckless or naive, had to admit the gravity of her words. Greta had refused to play the role handed to her. Kim had tried to make her a pawn in his geopolitical theater, but she would not be anyone's pawn. She did not thank him, did not acknowledge his warning to Israel, did not even mention his name. In that omission was her defiance. Dictators could not claim her. Her fight belonged only to justice. The statement unfolded with a rhythm that echoed her greatest speeches. There were pauses, lines short enough to be repeated as chants. There was conviction, sentences that could be clipped into headlines. And there was vulnerability, too. She admitted her fear, but framed it as a price worth paying. "I am not brave," she wrote. "I am simply unwilling to pretend that silence is safety." That sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples far beyond the room. It was Greta's genius to strip away the theater of politics and reveal its raw core. Silence was not safety. Silence was complicity. And in that truth, dictators everywhere found their masks slipping. Television anchors who read her words live on air faltered, their voices catching. Commentators who had mocked her found themselves forced to reckon with the power of her clarity. Even those unmoved by her cause could not escape the emotional force of her composure. Because where Kim's threats sounded like noise, Greta's calm rang like a bell. The world saw the hypocrisy unfold in real time. North Korean state media had plastered her image beside missiles, but Greta herself refused to be weaponized. Israel framed her as a provocateur, but her words revealed her as a witness. Between two states vying to control the narrative, a single detained activist reclaimed it. Her mic drop moment arrived in the closing lines of her statement. A passage that would be replayed on every network and shared across every platform. She wrote, "You may detain me, but you cannot detain the truth. You may silence me here, but millions will speak for me out there, and they will not stop. Not until justice is free." The silence after those words was profound. In courtrooms, in newsrooms, in living rooms, people paused, not because the words were loud, but because they demanded listening. Even in detention, Greta had seized the stage and turned it into a pulpit of conscience. Her defiance resonated louder than threats, louder than missiles, louder than the arrogance of power. And in that moment, a teenager with no army, no government, no weapons, outshone the generals and politicians who sought to control her. The shockwaves of that statement traveled far beyond Israel's borders. The moment Greta's statement hit the airwaves, the world didn't just listen. It reacted with a force that could be measured in hashtags. Headlines and hashtags flooding timelines like a digital tidal wave. Within hours, Free Greta shot to the top of Twitter's global trends. Hot on its heels came another, far stranger phenomenon: Dictators for Greta, a mocking echo of Kim Jong-un's attempt to seize the spotlight. Memes exploded. One showed Greta standing tall beside a cartoon Kim clutching a protest sign. Another reimagined the United Nations chamber, with Kim shouting while Greta calmly sipped tea. The absurdity of a nuclear-armed dictator posing as her champion was irresistible internet fodder. Every scroll brought new satire. Kim photoshopped into Greta's school strikes, Kim holding up a "How dare you" placard. Kim photoshopped into climate marches he would never attend. The internet had turned geopolitics into theater, and Greta, even in detention, was its reluctant star. But it wasn't only jokes. Celebrities joined the chorus, amplifying Greta's words to millions. Musicians dedicated performances to her. Actors shared her statement verbatim, calling her the conscience of a generation. Politicians from Europe and Latin America voiced support, while climate groups staged solidarity sit-ins at Israeli embassies. In capitals from Berlin to Buenos Aires, placards appeared with her closing line: "You may detain me, but you cannot detain the truth." Meanwhile, Israel felt the mounting pressure. International news cycles turned their spotlight on Tel Aviv, questioning whether detaining a climate activist had been worth the storm it unleashed. Editorials framed it as a moral blunder. A democratic state, already under scrutiny for its policies, now holding one of the world's most recognizable activists in handcuffs. Even allies grew uneasy, their diplomats privately urging Israeli officials to de-escalate. Each day Greta remained in custody, the calls for her release grew louder. Protesters camped outside consulates, activists staged creative demonstrations, sitting in the streets with their mouths taped, holding signs that read, "Silence is not safety." Every gesture echoed Greta's words back to the world. The effect was inescapable. Israel, long practiced in the art of managing global criticism, suddenly faced a narrative it could not control. This wasn't about complex policies or geopolitics. It was about a teenager with braided hair, a pen, and unshakable calm. The image was too powerful, the story too simple to spin. Greta became not just a climate activist, but a symbol of conscience trapped behind bars. Her release became inevitable. The only question was how to stage it. When Israel finally announced she would be freed, they framed it as an act of sovereignty, a demonstration of their judicial independence. But the world wasn't buying it. The release was celebrated not as Israel's decision, nor as Kim Jong-un's victory claim on North Korean state TV. It was Greta's moral triumph. The teenager had outshone the machinery of state power, proving that dignity could be stronger than detention. Kim, predictably, tried to take credit. State media aired triumphant montages of missiles and Greta's photo, narrators boasting that the supreme leader had defended the young activist. But outside Pyongyang's propaganda bubble, the global narrative was clear. Kim's threats were background noise, Greta's words were the music. He had tried to hijack the story. Instead, he had been reduced to a punchline in memes. In the end, it wasn't the dictator who won applause, nor the state that managed detention. It was the defiant activist who whispered truth louder than bluster. Greta walked free, and with her, the moral high ground shifted. But the real lesson wasn't about who freed her. It was about what her defiance revealed to the world. When the dust began to settle, one truth stood taller than the noise of threats, hashtags, and headlines. Greta Thunberg had carried more moral weight in silence than dictators could muster with armies. Her calm defiance had exposed a universal pattern: the louder power shouts, the more hollow it sounds when faced with genuine conscience. Even in handcuffs, even under the watchful eye of a state determined to make an example out of her, Greta's presence radiated dignity. Cameras had captured it, her eyes steady, her posture unshaken. No bravado, no theatrics, just resolve. Against that, Kim's bluster looked like desperation, a dictator begging the world to notice him by draping himself in borrowed credibility. It was an extraordinary contrast. On one side, missiles, propaganda, and performative threats. On the other, a teenager whose only weapon was honesty. And yet, it was the honesty that won. Because the world does not rally to arrogance. It rallies to courage. It does not share propaganda, it shares dignity. This is why her statement, "This is not about me. This is about justice," struck deeper than any missile test or televised rant. She had refused to let herself become a pawn, even when dictators tried to use her name as leverage. By doing so, she elevated the conversation beyond politics, beyond geopolitics, into something profoundly human. Think about that paradox. A nuclear arsenal on one side, a young woman's words on the other, and history will remember the words. The weapons fade into background noise, the speeches into archives. But the image of Greta in detention, whispering truth while others screamed, will endure, because symbols outlast regimes, and dignity outshines spectacle. This moment carried a lesson far bigger than Greta herself. It revealed the weakness of arrogance disguised as strength, and the enduring power of conscience disguised as fragility. It reminded us that true authority doesn't come from control, it comes from credibility. And credibility cannot be manufactured in a lab, nor forced at gunpoint. It is earned through sacrifice, through sincerity, through standing up when it costs something. Greta's ordeal wasn't just about climate or Israel or North Korea. It was about the timeless struggle between those who seek to control narratives through fear and those who dare to embody truth through courage. And for a fleeting moment, the world was united, not in agreement over policy, but in recognition of dignity. Her calm resistance had turned into a mirror, reflecting something back at us. It asked, what do we value? Whose voices matter? What kind of world do we want to uphold? And that's where the story deepens. Because the true power of this saga isn't locked in the spectacle of Greta versus her jailers, or even Greta versus Kim. The true power lies in the audience, in all of us who watched, tweeted, debated, and marched. Because if a single teenager can withstand dictators and states, then what excuse do we have for silence? If dignity can survive handcuffs, then what might it do if multiplied by millions? That's the moral that lingers. Justice beats propaganda. Courage eclipses arrogance. Dignity, even when bruised, even when bound, has the ability to bend history. And that's why this story isn't just about Greta or Kim. It's about us. So when Kim Jong-un warned Israel to release Greta Thunberg, the world saw a paradox, but also a revelation. A dictator who silences his own people tried to posture as a defender of freedom, only to be overshadowed by the quiet dignity of a teenager. In that collision of arrogance and conscience, the truth became impossible to ignore. Dictators may control nations, but voices of truth control hearts. That is why Greta's stand matters beyond this single episode. Because her resistance was never just about her, it was about the principle that justice belongs to anyone brave enough to claim it. Her calm defiance reminded us that even in a world of weapons and walls, conscience can still break through. And now the question turns to you. What did this story mean to you? Did it make you angry, hopeful, inspired? Leave your thoughts below, because your voice is part of this global conversation. If you believe that stories like this must be told, not buried, not twisted, but told with clarity and courage, then subscribe. Share this video. Be part of amplifying dignity over arrogance, justice over propaganda, truth over power plays. Because here's the reality. The next showdown might not be about Greta. It might be about a journalist in your country, an activist in your city, a student, a worker, a parent, someone who refuses to bow to intimidation. It might even be about you. And when that moment comes, history won't be written by the ones who shouted the loudest. It will be written by the ones who stood their ground quietly but firmly and refused to surrender their dignity.